It's great to see so many of you here tonight. So my name is Martin Buzzer. I'm a reader in physics at the University of Hull. And I hope you're as excited as I am about the lecture tonight. I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Matt Beach, in just a moment to chair tonight's lecture and of course to introduce our speaker. But before I do so, I just wanted to make a few housekeeping announcements. So first of all, please put your mobile phones on silent if you haven't already done so. Secondly, a very important part of this evening, of course, is the question and answers, and I just want to explain how you can submit questions for the Q&A session later on. You can basically submit your question in three different ways. Firstly, you can send your question as a text to the mobile number that's on the screen next to me. Secondly, you can send an email to the email address, obviously. Or thirdly, you can send it through the Mentimeter website. I've given you the link and the QR code. I hope that's big enough for you. Just type, and once you get to the website, just type the code that's on the screen. The signal in this hall is not always very good, so in case you're having problems accessing the internet, feel free to use the University of Hull guest Wi-Fi. Please send in your questions during Sir Stephen's lecture. To make it easier for us to select questions, please keep your questions brief and to the point. Okay, so any students, this is not your chance to write an essay. Okay? Just keep it brief, keep it to the point. We'll also have some live questions as well. So, without further ado, let me hand over to our chair for tonight, Dr. Matt Beach.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, my name is Dr. Matt Beach. I'm Reader in Politics and Director of the Centre for British Politics here at the University. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this lecture tonight on Do God and Politics Mix? So on behalf of the University of Hull, I would really like to warmly welcome you all again to this event this evening. So our lecture is part of an annual series called the Hull Lectures, which have been organised over the years by the University of Hull Staff Christian Fellowship. And the purpose of these lectures is to explore questions which are at the interface and the intersection of philosophy, society and faith. And we've been very privileged to have hosted many distinguished speakers in the past. And for this year, we're absolutely delighted to have Sir Stephen Timms to help us explore the intriguing topic of Do God and Politics Mix? Sir Stephen has been Labour MP for East Ham since 1994 and chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee since 2020. He was a minister in the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown from 1998 to 2010, including serving in the Cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury in 2006-07, and was Shadow Minister for Employment 2010-15. He is one of the leaders of the Plaistow Christian Fellowship and has been Labour's Faith Envoy since 2007 and chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society since 2012. He was knighted in 2022 for political and public service. So Stephen, it is a great pleasure for you to be with us tonight. So folks, the plan for tonight is this. So Stephen's going to talk to us and then we're going to have a Q&A session. And again, as Martin said, please do submit your questions during the talk using the different channels listed on the screen just here. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, can we give a very warm Yorkshire welcome to Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much for a very kind welcome. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming along. You might wonder what my qualifications are for this talk. I studied maths at university and started my working life in a computer company. But as you've heard, I have this year been MP for East Ham in the borough of Newham in the East End of London for 30 years. And before that, for 10 years, I was a local councillor in that borough, the borough of Newham. And I was rung up at home one day by somebody from a different part of the borough who told me her problem with some rubbish in her garden. And I couldn't work out why she'd called me. She rang me up at home, but I wasn't her local councillor, I wasn't involved in her local area, and I tried to explain that politely, that I wasn't the right person for her to speak to. And she said, "Oh, but you're always in the local paper talking a lot of rubbish. I thought you were the ideal person for the job." So I'll try and do a bit better this evening. But I want to make a couple of references tonight to the work of Tom Wright, the former Bishop of Durham, who's written a lot of books that I found very useful. He's 75, I think, now, but still going strong and writing thought-provoking, helpful books about Christian faith. For example, his biography of St. Paul was published 6 years ago. We've all heard of St. Paul. Most of us, I'm sure, will know of a church or a cathedral named after him, know that his name is on many of the letters in the New Testament of the Bible. But the idea of a biography of him, along the lines of the biography of any other influential thinker, for me was quite a startling one. And it draws on latest scholarship about what was going on in the world when Paul was active, and what made the man. But for me, it made him come alive in a way that was new. The first of the two letters in the New Testament of the Bible, which Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, includes this passage. He said, or wrote, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead." And I want to reflect on those words a little bit later in what I have to say today. One of my friends is the Labour life peer, Maeve Sherlock. She came to public attention first as president of the National Union of Students in 1988 to 90, and then as chief executive of what was then called the National Council for One-Parent Families, now renamed Gingerbread. Before 2003, she worked at the Treasury as one of the special advisors to Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor at the time, and she was working on issues like child poverty and welfare reform. And from 1999 to 2001, I was a minister at the Treasury, and that was where we met, and we worked together on a number of projects. In 2003, Maeve left the Treasury and became Chief Executive of the Refugee Council. And her job entailed visiting projects supporting refugees all over the country. And she told me later what happened. As she visited all these projects, it quickly became clear to her that the most extraordinary of them, often involving sacrificial levels of care by volunteers, they were run by churches or by Christian groups. Nobody had told her that was the case or warned her. She was puzzled by what she found, so she decided she needed to find out a bit more about Christianity. She noticed that a church near where she lived was running something called an Alpha course, and she decided to go along to that, and in due course she came to faith herself. Since 2010, she's been a member of the House of Lords. In 2018, she was ordained a deacon in the Church of England, and somehow she now combines a pretty heavy workload on the opposition front bench in the House of Lords with being the non-stipendiary associate vicar of St Nicholas's Church in central Durham, which has got a big congregation. I'm not quite sure how she manages to combine those two things. But I wanted to tell you about Maeve's experience, because what I want to argue this evening is that with things in the country in such a depressing state, and with so many things apparently not working as they should, school buildings, policing, the courts, the National Health Service, I think more and more people are looking to the churches and what is happening in the churches and are finding something different there, something more hopeful than they find elsewhere. And I think that is the key to how God and politics mix. I'm not from a church-going family, but I became a Christian in my teens. And growing up, as I did in the 1960s and 1970s, it was pretty clear that religious faith was on the way out. There were a fair number of elderly people who still believed, but we were growing out of all these old-fashioned superstitions, and it was really just a matter of time before the elderly churchgoers were gone and it would all be over. And a lot of people, I think, still feel that way. Newspapers publish regular statistics showing that church attendance has gone down again. The latest census showed that for the first time, fewer than half of people in Britain describe themselves as Christians. You know, that trend is pretty clear. And yet, I don't think those statistics tell us what is really happening. Certainly, looking back at what happened in the pandemic, I think we get a very, very different picture. Just after the lockdown began in 2020, it was Good Friday. I was sitting at home after a tiring parliamentary session and going through some unread emails. And there were 2 emails in there from constituents saying, I don't have enough food for the Easter bank holiday weekend, what should I do? And I really didn't know how to answer them. I've become very used in the last few years to referring people to food banks, but I thought they'd probably be shut over the bank holiday weekend. But looking further back through my emails, there was one from the directly elected mayor of our borough, the borough of Newham, Roxana Fiaz. And her email said, if you find people without enough food over this weekend, send an email to the Vicar of Ascension Church in the Royal Docks before 10 o'clock in the morning, and he will arrange for a food parcel to be delivered before 6 o'clock that evening. Now, 30 years ago, I was the leader of Newham Council doing the job that the elected mayor now does. At that time, we were polite to the churches, but we never worked with them as kind of partners in the way that this email indicated was the case at the start of the lockdown. Her suggestion, frankly, sounded a bit implausible to me, but I didn't have any better ideas, so I thought I'd better give hers a try, and sure enough, both my constituents received their food parcels later on that Good Friday late afternoon. And as the weeks went on, I saw that very large numbers of people in my constituency, many of whom in our very multiracial community had never set foot in a church before, had become dependent for the most basic requirements of life on the churches. In Parliament, as you've heard, I chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. And seeing what was happening, we commissioned Goldsmiths, University of London, to carry out some research. They sent a questionnaire to every council in the UK about cooperation with faith groups during the pandemic. And about half of the councils replied. And their replies made it clear that what I'd seen in my borough was in fact happening in pretty much every part of the country, in rural areas, in urban areas, in inner city areas like the one I represent. And the report from that research was published in November 2020 under the title Keeping the Faith, and you can find a copy of it on the website of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society. Local councils have long been pretty nervous about working with faith groups. They've been worried that if, like other voluntary sector organisations, they commission faith groups to deliver services, then one of 2 things will go wrong. Either the faith group will use the funds instead to try and convert people, or the service delivered will be biased in favour of their group to the disadvantage of everybody else. And working with faith groups just seems too difficult and complex. If you work with this group here, are you going to offend all the other groups over there? And let's be frank, the people involved in these groups are quite odd. They believe in God. Far simpler to give them all a wide berth and find somebody else less complicated to work with. But come the pandemic lockdown, there wasn't anybody else. Councils didn't suddenly start working with faith groups because they thought it would be nice to do so. They did it because they had no choice. The faith groups had the premises, the volunteers, and also the connections with people needing help that nobody else had. There was just nobody else to take on the job. It wasn't just churches, it was other faith groups as well, but of course it was churches who did the lion's share, and that was true also in my strongly multi-faith borough, where, according to the census, the proportion describing themselves as Christians is the lowest in the whole country. Our survey reported the reflections of council officers on this experience of working with faith groups in the pandemic. A lot of them were very surprised by what a positive experience it turned out to be. The anticipated problems, trying to convert people, bias in favour of members of the group, barely registered at all, but the strengths of churches and other faith groups, credibility through long-standing presence in the community, availability of enthusiastic volunteers, access to hard-to-reach and the most disadvantaged groups. Those strengths were absolutely key to getting communities intact through the worst of the pandemic. And one of the council officers told the researcher, because some researchers, a group went to speak in person to a selection of the councils who responded to the questionnaire. And one of the council officers said to the researcher, and I'm quoting, "My personal admiration for faith groups has gone through the roof. First, in terms of their commitment there. We as a local authority didn't know what we were getting into, and they've got involved with smiles on their faces, and they've done it professionally." A couple of weeks ago, I hosted in Parliament a meeting of our all-party parliamentary group about another of our great port cities who were describing an initiative called Love Southampton, in which the churches, supported by other faith groups, have been working with the city council to help hard-pressed residents to get through, first of all, the pandemic, and since then, the cost of living crisis as well. The chief executive of Southampton City Council said, and I quote, "Our city and its residents are better off through the ideas, innovation, partnership work and delivery of Love Southampton. Thank you." Well, far from being on the way out, it turned out that when in this decade the crunch came, communities became completely dependent on their churches. Nobody else had both the motivation and the capacity to help. And what I think the pandemic showed was that if you want to change things for the better in Britain today, if you want to find resources that can give communities hope in the face of all the challenges we are facing, then counterintuitive as it will seem to some, you should look to the churches. Now, in our history, we are all very familiar with the fact that schools, hospitals, great charities were started by churches or people in churches, but that was in history. It's different now. Or is it? I'm not so sure. New church-based initiatives started to appear on the radar in a big way with the food banks of the Trussell Trust. As austerity started to bed in from 2010 onwards, more and more people found they could no longer afford to buy food from shops, and so they turned to food banks. The number of them grew very rapidly. All the Trussell Trust food banks, which I think the Trussell Trust account for about a half of the food banks in the UK, every single one of them was based on a church. There are other food banks as well, outside the Trussell Trust, but most of them are church-based as well. The combination of capacity and motivation to help people who could no longer afford food was uniquely shown on scale by churches. Now, I was not a supporter of austerity policies, and I would have preferred it if the churches hadn't had to do what they did. But they did have to, and thank goodness for the contribution they have made. In the run-up to the 2010 general election, those with long memories will recall that David Cameron, wanting to make the case for reducing the role of the state, talked about the big society. In many ways, the Trussell Trust, it seemed to me, exemplified that idea of volunteers stepping forward to support their neighbours and help people in need. But the problem for the government was that the Trussell Trust didn't only hand out food parcels. If that was all they'd done, I think that would have been absolutely fine. But they didn't only do that, they also collected data on how many of these parcels they were handing out and the reasons the people they were handing them out to needed them. And that infuriated ministers. That wasn't at all what they envisaged as the big society. That instead was the churches interfering in the work of government. For a long time, Ian Duncan Smith, the then Secretary of State, refused to speak to the Trussell Trust because he was so cross with what they were saying. And in the end, I had to ask David Cameron, Prime Minister's questions one day, if he was willing to meet the Trussell Trust. And to his great credit, he said he would, and he was as good as his word, and he did. The food banks of the Trussell Trust, with others, should never have been needed, but they were, and I think a great debt of gratitude is owed to all those who volunteer in them and still are doing, and the demand is still going up today. Another extraordinary recent church-based endeavour with massive positive impacts is an organisation some of you will be familiar with called Christians Against Poverty. Founded in Bradford in 1996 by John Kirby, who had himself experienced crippling debt, but also had long experience working in financial services. Volunteers in churches are trained up as debt counsellors. They provide support to people in debt from teams that are based in churches, and those volunteers are supported by a big and pretty impressive back office set up in Bradford, and I was there when they dedicated their large new building in Bradford a couple of years ago. And that back office operation negotiates on behalf of indebted clients with banks and others to whom the debts are owed. And Christians Against Poverty, I think, does an amazing job supporting an enormous number of people to get on top of seemingly impossible personal debts, and also providing genuinely insightful analysis of why people get trapped in debt in the first place. As you've heard, I chair in Parliament the Work and Pensions Select Committee, which scrutinises on behalf of Parliament the policies and practices of the Department for Work and Pensions, and I've been doing that since 2020. Often when we want to speak to people on the sharp end of the social security system, we ask the Trussell Trust or Christians Against Poverty to put us in touch, because working from their churches, they are in touch with the people we need to hear from. They have the trust of the people we need to hear from in a way that no state institution really does, and in a way that is very rare. And I hosted an event in Parliament for Christians Against Poverty last week, in which they presented some research carried out by Loughborough University about the impact of debt, with 3 people personally suffering unpayable debt talking about their experience. Just a word about the widespread assumption that really people in churches are running food banks or supporting homeless people or doing all these other things in the hope of converting people. That is a perfectly understandable assumption, but I think it actually seriously misunderstands what is really motivating all the people who are doing all of these things. They are people whose lives have been changed by the good news that they've heard about from Jesus Christ, who find that out of gratitude they want to give to others. And what's really going on was, I thought, very well described by Tom Wright, who I mentioned earlier, in his book called Surprised by Hope, where he wrote this: people who believe in the resurrection, in God making a whole new world in which everything will be set right at last, are unstoppably motivated to work for that new world in the present. The people who are doing all these things have found in their faith that they want, mainly out of gratitude to God, to help make things better for others. If the others come to faith too, that's great, but that isn't the overriding reason for doing it. People with no religious interest or commitment can see that something good is going on. MPs looking around their constituencies for developments which are positive and often and offer hope for the future can see that what's happening in the churches is often the most promising and hopeful of all. And I think that's one reason why the attendance at the annual National Prayer Breakfast held in Westminster Hall in the Houses of Parliament continues to increase. They used to be pretty desultory events when I started to attend them 30 years ago, but today Westminster Hall is packed for the event, usually in June, starting at 7:30 in the morning. Very large numbers of members of Parliament attend, including often the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. And the successful formula for increasing attendance has been to get church members to attend and to invite their own MPs to attend as well. MPs are impressed by what they see the church is doing. They want to maintain a good relationship, and so large numbers accept the invitation every year. At the National Prayer Breakfast the year before last, in 2022, the speaker was Les Isaac. Born in Antigua, he was a Rastafarian as a young man, involved in gangs in London before he became a Christian. He was the founder, 20 years ago, in Brixton, of Street Pastors, which is a response to the rise of gun and knife crime, and another of these remarkable church-based initiatives changing communities for the better. And in this one, volunteers based in churches make themselves visible in city and town centres late at night and in the small hours, so that people who are drunk or at risk for some other reason could get some ready help, a bottle of water or some flip-flops or something, to walk safely to the station and reach home safely. Now, who else would do that in Britain today other than people from churches? And in his sermon at the National Prayer Breakfast in June 2022, Les Isaac said this. He said, "At the centre of our lives is Jesus and a desire to be like him and to fulfil his purpose here on earth. Many men and women are quietly demonstrating service, humbly and compassionately, for the common good of the community, of society, of their city and their nation." Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, was at the prayer breakfast, but he had to leave early. But among the MPs who stayed to hear that talk was Sajid Javid, who was then Health Secretary. Later that day, and you might remember all this, Sajid Javid resigned from the government. And he said it was listening to that talk, those words about integrity in public service, which made him jump. And as you remember, about 50 other ministers followed Sajid Javid's lead. Boris Johnson was eventually forced to resign. And, looking back on that response to Les Isaac's address was a pretty dramatic example, it seems to me, of God and politics mixing. And by the way, that fact that we ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister for over 3 years, I think, tells you quite a lot about the problems the country has got itself into. My observation of Boris Johnson in Parliament was that he's a clever man. He's a man of great talent. It looked to me, watching him from the other side of the chamber, as if he thought hard about what to say in any given situation. But in deciding what to say, the criterion, is this true, did not appear to be a major consideration. I don't think Boris Johnson set out to lie to people. It was just that in choosing his words, there were more important matters to take into account than whether they were true. And that was a hallmark of Boris Johnson's career, not just of his prime ministership. And the fact that nevertheless he became prime minister shows, I think, how far we've gone off the rails. In his 1976 book, The Call to Seriousness, the historian Ian Bradley showed how Britain was transformed by the evangelical awakening of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, spearheaded by initially the preaching of John Wesley. Everything about how the country worked was changed. The MP for this city, William Wilberforce, whose house I have enjoyed visiting in Hull, was instrumental in some of the key changes that came about. You can argue that it was Wilberforce's long-running and ultimately successful parliamentary campaign against the slave trade which established the moral legitimacy of parliamentary democracy, not just in Britain, but around the world. And Ian Bradley put it like this, quoting another historian, Harold Perkin, writing, I think in the 1960s. He said this: between 1780 and 1850, the English ceased to be one of the world's most aggressive, rowdy, outspoken, cruel and bloodthirsty nations, and became one of the most inhibited, polite, orderly and tender-minded. He also added two further adjectives to his list: prudish and hypocritical. But I've decided to list them out because I want to underline how positive it seems to me the impact of that so-called awakening was on the changes which it gave rise to. And it seems to me the state we're in now requires another awakening of a similar scale and along the same lines. And I'm one of those who thinks it could happen and who hopes that it will. And I think that unstoppable motivation of those people who believe in the resurrection could well be the key to bringing it about. What about the complaint that Christians are only doing all these things in order to convert people? Well, actually, as I suggested, not very many of the beneficiaries, as far as we can tell, are coming to faith. But people are coming to faith as a result of these things in a rather different way. There's another very interesting piece of research from the think tank Theos about what's happening in all these projects. They found that not all that many beneficiaries of food banks and so on do make faith commitments for themselves. But what is much more common is that others in the community see what the local church is doing, welcome it as a good thing, and offer to help out and want to support it, having never had any interest in Christianity before, and they're the ones who end up coming to faith rather than those on whom the help is targeted. That seems to be the mechanism through which people are indeed coming to faith. And such a lot of what is happening in Britain seems so discouraging. So much seems to be broken. So little seems to work in the way that we would like it to. But people do look at what's happening in the churches, and it makes them more hopeful about how things might be. They can see their grounds for optimism. Here are good things emerging and developing, kindness and thoughtfulness, benefiting strangers. All kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds want to be part of that and to help. And I hope we'll see more of that. I hope more people fed up with the meanness and the selfishness and the self-centeredness which characterises so much of our national life, including, without a doubt, our politics, will see in what the churches are doing something different, something more positive and something much more hopeful. And that they'll also want to find out what it is which is making these people and these initiatives different and is causing them to act with kindness and thoughtfulness, and will discover that it is that they believe in Jesus Christ and in his resurrection. And having learned that, They'll inquire further about these beliefs, which seem increasingly in some ways out of step with modern thinking, and that they will themselves then come to conclude that the Christian beliefs are in fact true and will make a Christian commitment of their own. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead. And realising that, or coming to a belief in that, does change everything. It changes the way we think about everything around us, the assumptions which underpin our choices and our actions, our words, the way we relate to others. And that's the key, I think, to bringing about the transformation which we're crying out for right across the country. And I hope that, having realised that, some of those people will want not just to get involved in supporting those who are struggling in their local communities, crucially important though that is, but also to apply this new way of looking at things, this unstoppable motivation to political service, so that, as Wilberforce did, it starts to transform politics as well, helps renew trust in politics, renews confidence that democratic politics is morally legitimate and can deliver for people in Britain as we face all these complex challenges ahead. That's how I see God and politics mixing. So, thank you very much for giving me the chance to set this all out for you this evening. I'm looking forward now to the discussion we're about to have. I'll be very happy to have a go at answering any questions you might have about any of that, or about anything else at all. Thank you.